the difficulty is there's several vaccines. Some have got to be better than others. Some have got to be safer than others. And because of the speed at which everything was introduced, we just don't have that long-term safety data. And, you know, some of my friends who are in the immunology business tell me that, you know, a lot of the safety has been glossed over, certainly in the mainstream media. I mean, the number of deaths, the number of serious side effects, by which I mean things like transverse myelitis, which is an acute inflammation of the spinal cord about 10 days after vaccination, where you actually get paralysis. And you know, we've not seen any data published. We know it happens, but we've not seen data published. Everyone's had anecdotes. And I think the reason it's not published is the same reason that you see in the back of many newspapers, full-page adverts encouraged from the NHS, paid for by our tax system, to encourage you to be vaccinated. So what you don't want in the same paper is someone saying, oh, you could be paralyzed if you have the vaccine. So it's been suppressed, unlike anything else I've seen.
Professor Karol Sikora is a British physician specialising in oncology and a leading world authority on cancer. A double first at Cambridge, a PhD and fellow at Stanford University, and clinical director for cancer services at Hammersmith for 12 years. He's published over 300 papers, he's written and edited 20 books, and is on the editorial board of several journals. And he's also been a member of the UK Health Department's Expert Advisory Group on Cancer and the Committee on Safety in Medicines, and he is, or was, the chief of the W.H.O Cancer Programme. So thank you, Professor Sikora, for joining me today.
Pleasure.
Can I start off with some background, Professor Sikora? You've become probably quite a well-known and an even controversial critic of the medical response so far to COVID-19. And I just wonder, how did you get to that point? What's made you critical of what's been happening in the past 2 years?
I think when I first saw right at the beginning what was going to happen to cancer patients, I actually took to Twitter. I'd never done Twitter before March of 2020. I opened an account and I have an amazing lot of followers, mainly because of my response. It was mainly to try and get over the message that if you ignore cancer and indeed heart disease, you're going to have more deaths from those two diseases than from COVID. And now, my stance since the beginning of this is that the politicians all over the world, it's nothing to do with our government, all over the world, have prioritized and been frightened by COVID and let everything else drift. And systems that don't have high capacity, such as the NHS, it doesn't have a high capacity. There's no redundancy in it compared to the systems in Europe and the systems in America. The outcomes are worse for patients that don't have COVID, and that's been the problem as I see it.
Right. So would you say that our response then to the pandemic and the institution of lockdowns and those kind of things is not the best way to go about it?
Lockdown is very difficult. The aim of lockdown right at the beginning seemed logical. It was to flatten the peak. So basically the health system could cope with it. And most governments did some sort of way of reducing the R number that even my grandchildren knows what the R number is. I had student notes to remember what it was when I did epidemiology as a medical student. But there's no doubt it's the only way. Lockdown, social distancing, mask wearing, all these things reduce the R number and therefore the speed of spread and therefore the peak level of the curve as it goes on. And that was the aim, and that seemed logical. Having said that, we've had several lockdowns, as you know, and different countries have used different timings, different levels. I mean, Britain has had a very British lockdown, I would say. There weren't policemen shooting you on street corners if you were walking around without a permit or accosting you at all, whereas in other countries there were, and even not far away, Spain, Portugal, people were asked to rat on their neighbours. If they saw them go out for no reason, they were to phone the police and be given €100. I mean, this is really an unusual event. So I think we've handled it. Lockdown probably was unnecessary. It probably hasn't made a difference to how the thing, maybe it flattened the peak a little bit, but in all the peaks we've seen in the 4 waves, the NHS has really coped up to a point. What it's not done well is cope with all the other things it should be doing. Hence, we have a waiting list of, no one really knows how much it is, but it's probably over 10 million people are waiting for something that they're not going to get anytime soon. And that's a worry for healthcare.
Does it surprise you that there seems to have been no real cost-benefit analysis done on whether, when you introduce a lockdown, what the downside is going to be?
None at all. Sure, you can look at predict the changes in the epidemiology of COVID, but what you can't do is look at mental health issues, employment issues, economic issues. How much does a lockdown cost? I remember right at the beginning, going to one of our cancer centres, it was deserted. There's motorway signs, stay home, protect the NHS, save lives everywhere. And it was a pleasure to drive on the M4, I can tell you. It's never been such a pleasure since. And I had my papers and my ID cards and essential worker, all that sort of stuff. No one's ever asked for it. And, I think the only time I was stopped was going on a train to Northumberland, where we have a cancer centre, with a whole load of kits with COVID boxes in it for testing antibodies and testing antigen. And the police stopped me at the station and said, "Are you going trekking?" Because I had it in a rucksack and I had walking boots on, because I was going to, I'd walk from the station to the centre. It's a nice walk. And that was the only time I was ever stopped. It was all very jovial, of course. And so I think, has it really made a difference? There's no details. Has lockdown caused economic harm? It certainly has. And no one's done the calculation. How many billions of pounds have we lost as a country because of the institution of lockdown?
So what's been, from your point of view, the collateral damage of lockdown as far as cancer and other major illnesses are concerned?
So I think 3 things, Philip. The first is patient fear. Patients, especially older patients, people over 60, which is the average age of cancer patients, is much older than we think, as we read the papers of pop stars and celebrities that get cancer, and they always seem young and beautiful. The average age of a cancer patient in Britain is around 66, 68, depending where. Sure, young people get cancer, children get cancer, but it's very rare, fortunately. So the problem we've got is that older people got so frightened by the propaganda from government, they just didn't bother to consult the doctor. The second problem was, even if you did phone up, you weren't going to be seen. You were put off by the whole system. Our local surgery here, I live in Beaconsfield, which is a relatively nice place west of London. And, it was like Fort Knox going. I collected a prescription for a neighbour, and I was shouted at as I entered not to come in, and I was wearing a mask, for goodness sake. I wasn't wearing an Ebola outfit, but I felt like going with a fancy dress and dressed with PPE just to go to the surgery. So, and the third problem was the hospitals really congealed. They put all the emphasis on COVID, and everything else stopped. Routine operations stopped. People couldn't get a CT scan. And for cancer, to make the diagnosis, you have to do 2 things. First of all, you have to get some sort of image of where you think the cancer is. It could just be a chest X-ray, more likely a CT or an MR scan. And the second thing you have to get is a biopsy, a piece of tissue to look at it down the microscope. The pathologist then calls it, classifies it, and there you have it. And then there's all sorts of other tests you do. But the only way you know you've got cancer is to do that. And if people aren't coming forward and they can't get investigated, get referred from their GP, and then they can't get the scans in the hospital, all 3 things mean there's delay. And the same thing happened for heart disease as well. It's not just cancer. The other thing where there's huge delays, and we're going to live with it for the next 5 years almost certainly, are things like degenerative bone diseases, joint diseases. So hip arthritis, knee arthritis, people haven't had the operations. They can't all be done suddenly this year. Some people will wait 3 or 4 years to get a hip replacement, and they'll be almost crippled by the time they get it. And that was probably completely unnecessary.
Well, I know that the NHS almost, well, it shifted its entire operation, I think, during a week before Christmas, and it stopped doing the normal things it normally does in treating various illnesses and just gave itself over to just the booster, or administering the booster vaccines. Was that something which will have an impact as well, do you think?
It will. You know, what really annoyed me before Christmas, this Christmas that is, so well, we knew a lot about Omicron, we knew a lot about what was likely to happen, and yet the worthies of the NHS Confederation, some hospital chief executives and so on, were criticising the government for not putting harsher measures on before Christmas. And what's happened? No harsher measures? No big deal. I mean, the hospitalizations are right down, they're going down fast now, and the number of people on a ventilator is around 500 in the whole country in a ventilator, what we call mechanical ventilation beds. That's the jargon for someone that could be ventilated. So if there's only 500, the total number of beds within the NHS is 141,000. It depends how you count, what you count as an acute bed, but there are roughly 141,000. So 500 is only a small percentage. And of course, they're scattered right around the country. It's not localized in one place, although London did have disproportionately high levels of admissions just before Christmas. And that peaked and has gone now.
Yeah. But what did surprise me, I think, as it seems to have surprised you too, is the way in which the media were never questioning what the government was doing. It was always urging them on to harder, faster, quicker interventions, more lockdown, earlier lockdown, longer lockdown. And that took me by surprise. I'm not sure if it took you by surprise too.
It did. I mean, I ended up not being able to read the BBC website because that was by far the worst. It was biased information, not necessarily pro-government, because it's not being pro-government about the Partygate, but very biased to the sort of orthodox view of COVID as a dreadful disease that's killing millions of people of all sorts of ages, and we've got to do something. And if you're not boosted, you haven't had a vaccine, you're a criminal, basically. And, you know, when Steve James, the anaesthetist at King's, very vocally, quietly and calmly argued with the health minister, Sajid Javid, on his visit to King, that he didn't believe he needed a vaccination and wasn't going to have it. The BBC fact-checking on Steve James, you know, they were clearly trying to demolish his arguments, but his argument was probably correct. He'd been infected, he'd got antibodies, he felt well, and probably there wasn't much need, but that was an extreme view. These views are not tolerated, in the same way that both of us have had things removed from YouTube because it was probably our computer just finds certain words it doesn't like and it throws it out, or fix it up for human review.
Yes, I've had a similar experience to you with BBC, not just the website, but also Radio 4, unfortunately, and I find it quite difficult to listen to. The fact checkers seem to me very keen on checking not so much the facts, but whether you're corresponding to the narrative, which is the agreed position. Let me ask you, though, about the effects of COVID have been severe. The government tells us that around about 150,000 people have died with COVID, rather than of COVID, but with COVID. Is there any way we can estimate what the collateral damage would be in terms of cancers and other conditions due to lockdown and to the effects of that?
It's very difficult, Phil. One of the problems we have is that the average age of death from COVID in the 150,000 you mentioned is 82.4 years. Now that's actually beyond the average age of death if you combine men and women in Britain, which is about 82 years, 81.9. So the majority of people that die with COVID beyond their sell-by date, if you like to put it the hard way. If you look at the life years lost, if you take a disease like cancer, let's assume it's 65, the average age of someone presenting with cancer, then, 65, you've got at least 15 years to go before your normal life expectancy comes. Whereas if it's 82.4 for COVID, the life years lost is much greater from 15 years lost to cancer than from maybe 1 year lost because of COVID coming along at the most. So I think, and it's exactly the same with heart disease. I mean, the heart disease that caused the biggest problem are people that had heart attacks when the coronary arteries get blocked by a plaque. And the treatment for that is emergency stenting, putting a little stent in. But people would you could see the graphs very beautifully demonstrated that people just didn't turn up to emergency room. They didn't dial 999, they didn't go in, and they didn't have stents. The level of stents went down about 45% during the first lockdown. And most of that was patients just sitting there with the pain. It eventually goes away if you survive the heart attack, but of course what it does is damage the heart muscle permanently. And a stent, if you put it in soon enough, corrects it and you go on forever. Well, not forever, no one goes on forever. You go on for a decent lifespan. Whereas if you don't get the stent, the heart dies, and later on in life you get heart failure. The muscle just doesn't cope, and get breathless and so on, get short of breath and cough. And so the future will have a lot of patients with heart disease that will actually suffer for the future because of what we did with COVID.
Right. Let me move on to the question of vaccines. I mean, vaccines seems to have been very successful. What's your view of the way in which vaccines have been used in the country here?
It is a very interesting combination of politics, media, profit-making Big Pharma. I mean, Pfizer, $28 a shot, and this is for a piece of RNA, which you just mass produce for pennies. I mean, okay, there's the research, there's the quality control, there's the distribution, I realize that, but that's a huge profit on and of course, it's sort of Big Pharma's always in league with governments. They have very powerful PR relationships with corporate and government sponsors and so on. So it was a reasonable thing. I've been vaccinated. I've had the triple. I'm not an anti-vaxxer, although people have thought I'm verging on to be an anti-vaxxer. I was one of the first to get it. Being a healthcare worker, we could go along and get it at 8 o'clock in the morning, early January last year, so the year before last. So we were having it. I think the difficulty is the several vaccines. Some have got to be better than others. Some have got to be safer than others. And because of the speed at which everything was introduced, we just don't have that long-term safety data. And, some of my friends who are in the immunology business tell me that, a lot of the safety has been glossed over, certainly in the mainstream media. I mean, the number of deaths, the number of serious side effects, by which I mean things like transverse myelitis, which is an acute inflammation of the spinal cord about 10 days after vaccination, where you actually get paralysis. And we've not seen any data published. We know it happens, but we've not seen data published. Everyone's had anecdotes. And I think the reason it's not published is the same reason that you see in the back of many newspapers, full-page adverts encouraged from the NHS, paid for by our tax system, to encourage you to be vaccinated. So what you don't want in the same paper is someone saying, you could be paralyzed if you have the vaccine. So it's been suppressed, unlike anything else I've seen. The problem with the vaccine is it's leaky, by which I mean it doesn't always mount a very powerful response. If you take polio or you take hepatitis, which there's precedent for, they're very powerful vaccines. There are very few side effects, and more importantly, they're very effective at prevention. Whereas this one is not. The fact that we needed the booster, the fact that probably if we're going to carry this forward, people will need another booster in about 6 months. Will that be done? Who knows? There's no discussion about it. No one knows what to do.
Right. Do the vaccines I know that they provide some degree of protection for the individual who has them. That's the whole purpose of them. But what about in terms of transmission of the virus from one person to another?
It doesn't seem they're very good at doing that. They certainly prevent severity of illness, and that's clearly, we've seen that people that are vaccinated have less hospital admissions, less need for ventilators. But do they actually reduce transmission? Do they reduce the R factor by having an immune population? They don't seem to. It is true that, again, this is something Steve James said quite convincingly, and it's quite correct, that natural immunity is a more powerful response than vaccine immunity. And the reason for that is that the whole business of the immune system, it's not just antibodies, it's a combination of antibodies, T cells, other parts of the immune armamentarium in ways we don't understand that coalesce to provide the immunity. But what it doesn't seem to do is reduce the transmission very much. So, and that was one of the reasons why the mandatory vaccine for NHS staff was backtracked, because, you know, it becomes if you're not causing a reduction in the spread of the disease, then the decision to be vaccinated is surely yours. If it's only for you, you should call the tune as to what you want to do.
Yeah, so that's what puzzled me, the fact that there were these mandates for vaccination, which could only really be substantiated on the basis, it seems, of stopping the infection from spreading, and yet it doesn't seem to do that, or that's not its primary, it's not one of its main abilities to influence, unfortunately. You mentioned natural immunity. Natural immunity has surprisingly had a bad press. People seem to have been rubbishing the idea of natural immunity in some quarters. I just wonder, is natural immunity as good as vaccine immunity?
It's probably better in most people. And the reason for that is that the immune system is much more powerfully stimulated by the live virus. Sure, you get the disease with it, but it's more powerfully stimulated than with a very small fraction of the total genetic makeup and therefore the protein that comes off the mRNA vaccine with Pfizer and the other one, Moderna. With the Oxford vaccine, that's an attenuated bug. It's it's a cross between an adenovirus from a monkey and some of the sequences from coronavirus. And that, again, seems to have a weaker response compared to natural immunity. So at the end of the day, the idea was at the beginning herd immunity, which suddenly became a bad word. It was like mentioning a swear word or something if you said herd immunity somewhere. The idea of the herd, this is for animal epidemiology, would actually, once you got a certain percentage of the sheep, say, immune, the rest were protected because the bug couldn't spread. And it's the same principle here. And it led to something called the Great Barrington Declaration. Great Barrington's a place in Massachusetts and near Boston. And quite a lot of scientists signed it, but it was poo-pooed for a long time. At the end of the day, it's the combination of having a group of people that have been infected and therefore a group of people that have been immunized and therefore at least have partial immunity. And then, of course, you've got people that are infected, and it doesn't matter what they're already infected. And then you've got the susceptible whole, and once the pool of susceptible people starts falling, which it has now, for all sorts of reasons, partly because the virus is mutating, all sorts of things, then you come out of the pandemic and the virus becomes endemic. That's the conventional wisdom. It doesn't matter how you get your immunity, basically.
Does that mean that herd immunity is really the only way out at the end of the day?
As far as I can see, I'm not an epidemiologist, Philip, but when I explained this, when I'm asked questions about it, it's the only way you get out of this. And you only get out of it by making the virus endemic and much milder as an illness. And that's where we've got to now. And it's time to pull all the stops. And again, going back to the media, it was just completely amazing. Only a month ago, people were saying, it's dreadful, we're going to go back into lockdown and all this sort of thing. There was no evidence whatsoever. Today program that you love, you told me so, I couldn't listen to that because you heard the same people saying the same nonsense, really, and with no questioning from either the reporters or the interviewers or anybody else. There was no discussion.
Yes, I found I don't listen to it anymore either, unfortunately. But there we are.
It was good.
Let me before we leave the question of vaccines, it's only just been the case, as you've already mentioned, that the NHS has no longer there's no longer a requirement for all the staff to be vaccinated. But isn't there an argument that that there should be a vaccination? For example, if I'm correct, I believe most doctors or surgeons have to be vaccinated against hepatitis. Why doesn't that argument apply in the case of coronavirus?
That's a very good question. Now, hepatitis, as I explained, the vaccine is very powerful. It creates antibodies that can be detected within a month. And many people, including myself, have one shot when I was a young doctor, and I've had antibodies every year, and you can check for it, and it's very reliable. And so every year with my appraisal, I have to have an antibody certificate to hepatitis. I don't need to have a shot again. I just need to show that I'm immune. And it's only for doctors that are working with patients, putting needles in. So in oncology, you put needles in to give chemotherapy, to take a biopsy, and that sort of thing. So I'd be classed as someone that has to conveys a risk of hepatitis if I'm not vaccinated. Now, nobody seems to object to that, and I'm sure people that are thought of as anti-vaxxers wouldn't object to that, and they've been doing it for years. The problem with corona is the disease for most people is not at all severe. The vaccines are much riskier simply because they've not been around more than a year by definition, and then they're leaky, they don't work that well, and it's exactly like the flu vaccine that we advise the over 60s to have, and NHS staff can have it, but we know it's a poor vaccine. It changes every year. Sometimes you're lucky and you predict the right sequences. You try and look at Asia because Asia gets the variants first, and then you predict which sequences are coming over on Singapore Airlines, and you vaccinate people for those. But it's the very fact you have to do it every year compared to the one shot of hepatitis that I've ever had. And so it's a different system. And the other one, if you take polio for children, I think that, again, it's simple, it's oral, it's not a sugar cube, and it's very powerful. And it has eradicated polio over the last 50 years, very few. And polio was such a disabling disease. I am too young, even now, to remember it. There was no polio when I was a kid, simply because of vaccination. The tragedy, of course, if you have anti-vaccines thoughts based on corona and what's happening, the same thoughts apply in people's minds, parents' minds, to childhood vaccination programs, which is rather sad. So there has been a decline in all the vaccines for children. The take-up has dropped over the last year because of all the anti-vax corona stuff. And it really reflects what we were saying earlier, the lack of balanced discussion in the media about anything that implies that maybe the corona vaccine is not really a godsend that it's made out to be. That's the problem we've got. It's having a detrimental effect on childhood vaccination programs.
Should children be vaccinated with coronavirus? The vaccine, is that something?
The risk, if you do any sort of risk-benefit analysis, the risk is much greater of the vaccine than the disease. So I would say no. Most of my colleagues would say no. What's interesting is that the JCVI, the Joint Committee on Vaccination and Immunization, also said no, but they got overturned by the Chief Medical Officer. But it's consent from parents. You can't just force it on children. So parents are sensible. And on the whole, I think the uptake rate in the 11 to 16-year-olds has been only about 50% because of that. And the problem is that the children can only, the Oxford vaccine caused profound a high level of side effects. The Pfizer vaccine, the Moderna vaccine, much less, so that's what's being used in the children. Having said that, the biggest problem is heart inflammation, myocarditis, which is just inflammation of the muscle of the heart, that's all that means, and it can be severe. And you can't predict who's going to get these relatively rare side effects. So you immunize 1,000 children, 2 get side effects, but you can't predict which 2. Because if you could, you'd say don't vaccinate them because the risk is too great. But that's the problem with it all. And we don't understand the mechanism. And it's almost certainly individual cross reactions between their genes and the vaccine.
Okay. I mean, there is a system which logs various adverse reactions, including myocarditis. In this country, it's the yellow card reporting system, and in America, they've got one called the VAERS system. Does the data that comes from that, is that accurate, and is it something we should be taking note of?
The yellow card system's been around. I was on the CSM, Committee of Safety of Medicine, for several years. And the yellow card system is a very good one. Any doctor, any health professional can fill it in if they think that the side effects in a patient is related to a drug, and it's recorded. And having that relatively low level of information, if it's with computers, you collate the whole thing. And if there's any trend, you would notice it. You'll probably remember the thalidomide business, which was a drug, Contergan was its trade name, that was given to mothers that were pregnant, that were very sick, just for a period of about 3 months. Some mothers, some pregnant women really have profound vomit and morning sickness, basically. And this dealt with it. Unfortunately, the children developed what's called phocomelia, short limbs, arms, legs, and so on. And some are very severely deformed. And you would, without a system like this, you'd never pick it up. It took forever to pick that up. This was, I can't remember when it was after, it was before I qualified. It must have been in the early 60s. And the yellow card system is a pre-computer way of collecting as much data as you can. Now, of course, it can be computerized and you can fill yellow cards on the internet. So it's not as primitive as it seems. The difficulty is you've got to have the level of suspicion. And again, because of the way everything's reported, do we want to see detrimental effects of vaccines? The answer is we've got to collect all the information. It doesn't mean you're anti-vaxxer because you send in a yellow card about a patient that's had a side effect. I mean, say there was a rare side effect, really rare, that you wouldn't spot. So you need to look at maybe 100,000 reports to identify what the relationship is. And that can be done with the yellow card.
If I remember correctly, the yellow card reporting system has listed many different adverse reactions, including death at the end of it. And I think, if I remember figures correctly, it's approaching 2,000 people on the yellow card reporting system have died following a vaccination. Is that usual, or is that what you'd expect?
One of the problems is the priority of vaccination was elderly people, and death is directly correlated with age. So if you target the vulnerable, as it was called at the beginning, and you target people over 80, they're likely to die. Someone at the age of 80, even if they're healthy, is likely to die within the next 3 years. That's the part of the problem. So if you correct for age, it may be that even still you'll see something. And that's the beauty of the yellow card system. If you have enough data, you begin to see correlations you can't see immediately. And we have a very bad system for correlating, even within the NHS, because of the computer systems are not really up to scratch. There's no electronic patient record. We should make all this unnecessary, because it would all come through the computer records. Vaccine, death, vaccine, transverse myelitis, and so on. And you just need to look at a very sad episode in British healthcare, the Shipman affair, where the GP in Manchester had something like 200 deaths actually in his surgery over a period of 2 years, and no one noticed. And ambulances were called to take away bodies, and everyone thought this was normal. This receptionist, oh, well, this was another death of an old lady, and he was giving lethal drugs to them. And it took a long time to pick that up. But you'd think that there would be some system that would identify that this general practice has had a lot of something bad effects.
Well, it's probably the problem probably was that it was the doctor himself who was meant to alert people to the danger.
But you think the ambulance crews would say, I've been here before. I was here last week. This doesn't happen anywhere else, you know.
Let me ask you, let's move on to treatments now, because we've had a lot of information and a lot of urging and a lot of emphasis placed upon vaccination as the way to beat this particular virus. But we've heard virtually nothing about treating the illness. It seems to me that if you catch it, you're told to stay at home until maybe you turn blue or something, and then you are admitted to hospital and put on a ventilator. Is that appropriate, or have I caricatured it incorrectly? Is there a treatment for COVID?
The treatments are not great. Antivirals have had a bad experience all the way through. The difficulty is that the viruses are very similar to our basic molecular machinery. So something that kills the virus also has profound side effects by damaging our replicative genetic machinery. So the drugs are out there now. The clinical trials show some benefit for some of them. Molnupiravir is perhaps the one that Pfizer make that is the most advanced, but it's sort of used really you have to use it early. There's no point waiting for someone to go blue before you start using the antiviral. And the trouble that means is that because you can't predict who's going to go blue, except by their age, the older they are, the more likely they're going to have serious problems. You can't target the right patients, basically. So the ideal solution is to give the drug at home, just have it delivered by courier within an hour or two by NHS 111. You bring it around, the tablets, so they're easy to take. The trouble is they have side effects as well. You know, no one's had long enough to do the proper risk-benefit analysis of antivirals early in the phase of the illness. Especially when the people you'd want to target are the ones that are old, ill, with other diseases, lung, heart disease, and immune suppression as well. So, and now the virus is becoming less and less serious in terms of the illness it causes. It seems not a good time to start using antivirals, but they're expensive. Molnupiravir from Pfizer is about £500 for 24 pills, which is the normal dose over a period of 3 or 4 days.
Right. I know that Tess Lawrie and the Bird Group, as it's called, I think, which have been recommending treatments, have also strongly recommended drugs such as ivermectin, which I know has been strongly attacked in the media again as a horse dewormer. But many people seem to have been taking that privately or off their own prescription, I suppose. People like Joe Rogan in America, and told Lawrence Fox in this country is also self-medicating on that. What do you make of drugs like ivermectin? Is there anything in that or not?
Well, I looked into it because I looked at the literature, and there's a very good review, which is unfortunately negative. It's a meta-analysis where you get all the world literature and you do a meta-analysis. You put all the data in. Some of the papers have a lot. They're randomized studies with 400 or 500 patients in each group. Other are just 20 in each group, which are much less powerful. And the statisticians play with the data. And the conclusion was that ivermectin had little, if any, activity. You can't say it doesn't have any activity. It is dirt cheap. It's used for river blindness. It's used for all sorts of things in the developing world, and it's less than 10 cents a tablet. How cheap can you get a drug? It's cheaper than aspirin. And of course, the conspiracy theorists say, well, no drug, and it's of course generic. You don't make any profit because anyone can make it without have a patent on it. So, and it's got a great name, ivermectin. It sounds pretty powerful. It's also used for scabies. It's the most effective treatment for scabies, which is a skin irritation people get. And it's almost impossible to get now because of the, I have a patient that has scabies and I tried to prescribe it and you can only get it by special, and it's because people were using it for corona in all sorts of ways. It was difficult to order it even with a prescription.
Why do you think there's been such a clampdown on drugs such as ivermectin, which would be considered relatively harmless from the point of view of virtually no side effects, and although it's off-label, why not try it out? Why has there been such a strong reaction, such that I think it's even penalised by law in Australia, that you can't prescribe it for this particular illness? Does that make sense?
It makes no sense, and it's back to this suppression of any dissenting view around the whole corona cascade, the corona theatre, if you like. You've got to suppress any dissent, and ivermectin got caught into that. And you're right, it's very strange. It's labelled with the anti-vax movement and the anti-lockdown movement and the COVID deniers. It's all part of the same thing. It's very strange. Again, YouTube would take you down if you started saying things about ivermectin. You'd never be invited to talk on the Today program ever again.
I probably need to just add the rider that nothing that we're saying today is prescribing any treatment to anybody, and if anyone wants to treat any illness they've got, they need to see their own GP.
Absolutely.
Just clarify that. Let me move on then to testing. In this country, we've started, well, testing almost everybody, and almost everybody twice a week. I know that all the students at the university where I teach, they are recommended to test themselves twice a week. School children are recommended to test themselves that often as well. Is there value in doing that, or is there danger in doing that?
The danger is you increase the fear, the awareness, and you've got no treatment to offer, really, no serious treatment. If someone's got no symptoms, they're not short of breath, there's no need to do anything. And we're taught as medical students, even to this day, we teach the student, don't do diagnosis for the fun of it. Do a diagnostic test if it's going to change the way you're going to treat someone. And on the whole, the test for COVID doesn't. If someone comes short of breath, ill, loss of taste, sore throat. Sorry, is the noise worrying your recording?
I can hear some noise in the background, but I think we'll be all right.
It's my grandchildren have come round for tea. Not with me.
All right.
Because the normal care lady for the children from my daughter has got COVID positive. She was tested for no reason.
You're standing in for the care then.
Yeah, that's it.
I was talking to Peter McCullough, and he says that we should stop testing asymptomatic people immediately. Is that something you'd
completely? There's no reason to keep doing it as long as people have no symptoms. Temperature testing is actually probably more effective. That's the here and now. You get the result instantly, and you can do it very quickly. So in our cancer center, we test everybody's temperature. Obviously, we tell people don't come if you're feeling unwell, but we check people's temperature. That's a much better way of doing it. It's interesting how the travel industry have dabbled with temperature testing, especially in the Gulf and the Middle East, where they had temperature sensors all around airports and remote temperature sensors. No one actually came to you. Shopping malls in Dubai, there were gadgets that could pick up people that had a temperature. They stopped doing it in the end because what are you going to do if someone has a temperature? You're going to arrest them? You've got a temperature, come to the prison.
Well, it's a rather blunt instrument, really, isn't it? Because you can have a temperature for many different reasons.
We had one staff member that runs a temperature of about 38.5. It's a normal body temperature, 38.5. And so it never went away. And when you give paracetamol, it went down a bit. When she stopped, it went up. So it's clearly there's lots of reasons for that. So as you say, blunt instrument. But I totally agree with Peter McCulloch. Let's stop it now.
The danger, of course, is, or the idea is that there are many false, or a number of false positives, which although it may be a small percentage, 1% or whatever it may be for these tests, if you test 1 million people, 1% of 1 million ends up with quite a large number.
Yeah, and the argument, of course, is what are you going to do with them? You're going to isolate them all, which means their workforce will be depleted. What are you going to do with people? There's all sorts of inconsistencies, and the fact that if you've been vaccinated, even a long time ago, you don't have to isolate if you live with someone with COVID. But if you haven't been vaccinated, you have to isolate. There's no logic in that at all, because as we said earlier, vaccination doesn't necessarily prevent transmission. So the logic would be to isolate everybody. I mean, in this country, isolation was never really enforced. I mean, whether you've come back from, other than from red countries, it was never really enforced. People went about their business, people went to work. In other countries, they're a bit more strict, and especially in Asian countries, Singapore, Hong Kong, China, you got locked up if you didn't comply, whereas here, no one ever suggested doing that.
Right. Moving on from tests, can I ask you about one of the things which has become most ubiquitous in our country and probably around the world these days, is the use of masks. And I just wondered what your thought on that is.
Yeah, when we start, I'm sort of an anti-masker, I guess, just intuitively, I don't like wearing a mask. And, where I don't mind is in a healthcare setting. That's the rules. We've got to have rules. If I don't wear a mask, then what kind of example am I showing? If the rule is we all have to wear masks, let's just do it. And I was walking around the hospital with my mask, sort of my nose showing, and the infection control sister came up and said, "Professor, you're not wearing your mask properly." And she did it quite aggressively, I thought, but never mind. From then on, I always wore it properly. But on a train, on a commuter train, not necessarily a crowded train, why do we need masks? And at the moment, tomorrow morning, I'm getting a very early train to Newport in Wales. So I get it from Reading, which is not far from here. And until I get to the Severn Tunnel, I don't have to wear a mask. When I go through the Severn Tunnel, it enters Wales, I have to wear a mask. And they have people shouting at you. So you have to shout back exempt, and anyone can declare they're exempt from masks.
Right, that's handy to know.
Yeah.
So, I mean, are there any downsides of wearing masks? I mean, most of the school children in this country are now required, well, according to the government, they didn't have to wear masks from, I think, last week onwards. But many schools have ignored that. Many schools are still requiring their school children to wear masks from the moment that they come into the school, sitting through all the lessons until the very end. They think they're probably being super cautious.
I think they're being super cautious. I think now the need for masks anywhere is gone. Let's use it in a healthcare setting just in case there are more vulnerable people in healthcare settings by definition. But the downside of masks, in learning environments, are simply that facial expression is an important part of communication, especially for younger children. They see someone smile, they see someone happy, and they learn the emotions that go with it. So forcing masks on teachers and children is deleterious to the learning experience. And university students, a lot of stuff is still done remotely, and that's deleterious for students to do things from a room somewhere. You really wonder why they bother going to university. Part of it, maybe not your university, but part of the trouble for students is it's part of the growing up experience to go somewhere often away from home and to have a life that's different from what they would have at home if they sit with a computer. And we've ruined a whole generation for the last 2 years of student experience throughout the country because of this.
Yes, I think that's the case. I think that the thing which has struck me most forcefully about masks is when I go walking around Tesco's or Sainsbury's or some other supermarket, as I have done this last week. And even though there are no mask mandates for walking around supermarkets, I would say 90%, if not more than that, are still wearing masks, despite the fact the government says you don't have to anymore. And what that speaks of to me is that the huge level of fear which has sort of embedded itself in our society.
That's absolutely correct. It's a fear. And, it's interesting. The commuter train in the early morning from here is full of mainly financial service people, highly educated, relatively wealthy, and they all wear masks. And I'm about the only one that doesn't wear it. There's no compulsion to wear a mask, but if you go onto the underground line, if you go onto the bus, the number 18 bus down the Euston Road at the same time, about 6:30, it's predominantly working class, high level of ethnic workers, and none of them wear masks and haven't from the beginning, even though it was mandatory. They just didn't bother and no one stopped them. And I think that's the problem. It's not that good a protection for anybody. It doesn't protect you and it doesn't really protect others that much. If you want to do it properly, you have to wear the FP3 masks that we wear in hospitals, which have got a sort of a filter in there. They're designed for building sites where there's a lot of dust coming out when you do masonry and with special drills that produces a lot of dust.
Well, they're properly sealed, aren't they, all around there?
Exactly. And you have
Whereas I think I've seen a paper quite recently which said that 80% of the exhaled air that comes out goes around the mask or over the mask or around the sides of the mask, which really makes it not that effective against an aerosol-borne disease.
No, I think it's part of the process that you feel you're doing something, governments feel they're doing something. And, the last bastion of mask wearing is going to be aircraft travel. I mean, no airline's going to, and there's no exemption there. You have to wear it. I mean, you see all these pictures on YouTube of people being thrown off aeroplanes, especially in the States, for not wearing a mask. That again, hospitals, I don't mind. Aircraft, well, I suppose if I want to fly, I have to obey the rules. Just like I have to wear a safety belt. Probably the chances of it saving your life is relatively slim, but we all wear it and we accept it.
Is there any way of winding down the fear which has been wound up so spectacularly successfully over the last couple of years?
That is the key problem. Can you wind the fear down? Can you make cancer patients or patients with cancer symptoms go to their doctors? Can you wind down the fear when I walk down the main street here? So old people jump into the road to avoid me, and they're still doing it. Not because they don't like me, but they don't want to be within a meter or 2 meters off me. Yes. So they don't even look around to see a lorry bearing down on them. It is a ridiculous overreaction we've got, and it started by government. If you remember the whole business of these pings that you would get if you try to develop the phones that would go off ping you if you just passed within a meter of someone that subsequently tested positive, and it's just not like that. That's not that sort of infection.
No, but winding the fear down may take as much effort as
it will. And
some people will never ever stop wearing masks from now on. I've heard.
You're right. What's fascinating is there's a train to Bicester Village, which is the outlet shopping mall in Bicester. And it's the only place on British Railways, on a British train, where they have 4 languages: Arabic, Chinese, English, and French. It's amazing to hear the announcements. And it goes past where I live. And there, even 5 years ago, people from Asia were wearing masks because of the first SARS pandemic, which was in 2004. So even 16 years later, these people have been conditioned to wear, and it looks so odd because you never saw masks in the UK. Now, they're all wearing masks, the British, the Asian, and so on. And if it takes that long for that pandemic to cause the fear to go, it's going to do the same for this. So I reckon even 2030, some people will still be wearing masks.
And yet, as one scientific paper has put it, the effectiveness is 0 and its purpose is merely theatre, which is interesting. And yet, even rationality doesn't seem to get through the fear which people seem to have, unfortunately.
No, that's absolutely the case.
As we're approaching the end of our talk, can I ask you, Professor, how do we get to the end of the pandemic itself? What should we do in order to, from this point on, to try to control this best? What would be the right approach?
You know, it's a fascinating question. You've got to get rid of the fear, as we discussed. In Albert Camus' book, The Plague, which I read at the beginning, I recommend it to everybody. It's a mythical plague set in the 40s in Tunisia, not Tunisia, Morocco, a northern African town, French at north, Algeria. And it's a very powerful story. And the doctor says, how does the plague end? And the president says to the chief medical officer, it ends when we say it ends, and everyone believes us. And that is exactly it. You have to say, it is over, believe me, and the people do. And so we've got to get rid of the fear. We've got to stop these adverts still appearing in the papers, encouraging you to do various things, vaccinations, to not go out if you've got a temperature. Remove all those notices everywhere that are there on the pavement, on the walls, pictures of masks, pictures of arrows that you go this way and that way with barricades in between. I can't understand how something like Sainsbury's can say we want people to wear masks in Sainsbury's when there's no compulsion to do so. What's the data they have that everyone else doesn't have? It's that sort of illogicality. Of course, what they're doing, it's probably a PR trick on their part to try and encourage people that are scared, the older people, to come to Sainsbury's rather than to Tesco's, where they don't insist on it. But who knows?
Yes, I think the conditioning in that kind of way is very hard to break. So one of the things, I mean, it's over when we say it's over, and one of the things I think that might contribute to that is the ending of the constant reminder on a daily basis from people like the BBC of how many people have died with COVID. We have this data, the statistics coming out so regularly that it's certainly reinforcing people's fears that 100 people have died today of COVID. But what I often find is that there's very little context to all of that. And if you recall that about, I think, 1,600 people die every single day, if we were reminded of how many people died every day of cancer, or how many people died every day of heart failure, I think we'd be just as fearful of that. But it's only COVID that gets the headlines.
And it's the way it gets the headlines. For example, on the website, the BBC website that I looked at, I forced myself to look at it a few hours back. It said yesterday, 62,000 people contracted COVID, something like that. Now, 62,000 is far less in any 24-hour period. And we're testing 1.4 million people a day. So 60,000, and people don't get tested if they, on the whole, don't have symptoms. That's and these are PCR tests, not lateral flow tests. So I think to make that statement that 62,000 people got COVID in the last 24 hours without saying it's actually lower than any day for the last 3 months, it's just out of context. And none of these people, very few of them have gone to hospital. So, and almost nobody's ended up on a ventilator. So these are all things that are omitted in this, as you say, this drive to alarm people, which has got to come to an end. Otherwise, the pandemic won't end.
Yes, it'll end when we say it will end. My final question for you, Professor, is if you were to have the opportunity to look back in 100 years' time as to what we've done this time, what do you think, how do you think history will judge us?
I think quite harshly. I think we don't have the data yet. It'll take 3 or 4 years to get all the data. And when we look at what happens to cancer death, heart disease death, mental health issues, and then the impact, long-term impact on people that have arthritis because they can't get procedures, all this sort of thing will be taken into account. Then you can review it. Having a public inquiry next year, it's of no value. That all the politicians involved will be gone within a year, their half-life, including our Prime Minister, his half-life's not for much longer, I would have thought. So a public inquiry does nothing. We need that data, and we can't predict what it's going to be like. So that will be the most interesting thing. And it's going to fill medical publications for the next 10 years, I suspect, analysis of the data and comparing different countries to see how they handled it differently with the outcomes for different diseases. So that will be a huge data set. And of course, with the power of artificial intelligence and computing that we've got now, it should guide us when something new happens in the infection world, how to react in a better, more logical way.
Right. I remember reading an article, I think it was in The Spectator, some time ago now, where they were trying to judge that particular question of how history might judge us. And they came to the conclusion, or they said that from their point of view, people from 100 years ago ahead will look back at us and think, from a medical point of view, not much has happened. No number of excess deaths were not that great, not that huge an impact. But economically speaking, it'll look like an asteroid has hit us.
Yeah. And, you know, the more worrying thing now is the cost of living is going up, the cost of everything. Just a pint of beer in London, now £6 in most places. And £6 for a pint of beer. And that is a reflection of the pandemic. I mean, it's other things as well, supply chain, making things, getting labor. And it's probably a combination of Brexit as well coming at the same time, so you can't get the staff. So all these things impact on the price of a pint of beer. I mean, it's almost ludicrous to think about it, but it is very complex interaction we have in society of all these things. And then the educational system that we're both part of, you know, that has been profoundly impacted. It's not just the experience for students, but they're probably their job opportunities and their ability to earn decent money has been impaired by this. And of course, taxation will go up, national insurance is going up, and so on.
But all of these things, of course, are the effect not so much of the virus itself, but our response to the virus.
Exactly. So our response is more important on these things than the virus. And the age distribution of the deaths for COVID was totally different than the age distribution of deaths from cancer, heart disease, and other things. So, and mental health problem, it covers all ages.
Professor Karol Sikora, thank you very much indeed for a very interesting conversation today. Thank you.